Conservation movement. The conservation movement, also known as nature conservation, is a political, environmental, and social movement that seeks to manage and protect natural resources, including animal, fungus, and plant species, as well as their habitat for the future. Conservationists are concerned with leaving the environment in a better state than the condition they found it in. Evidence-based conservation seeks to use high-quality scientific evidence to make conservation efforts more effective. The early conservation movement evolved out of necessity to maintain natural resources such as fisheries, wildlife management, water, soil, as well as conservation and sustainable forestry. The contemporary conservation movement has broadened from the early movement's emphasis on use of sustainable yield of natural resources and preservation of wilderness areas to include preservation of biodiversity. Some say the conservation movement is part of the broader and more far-reaching environmental movement, while others argue that they differ both in ideology and practice. Chiefly in the United States, conservation is seen as differing from environmentalism, and it is generally a conservative school of thought which aims to preserve natural resources expressly for their continued sustainable use by humans. Outside the U.S., the term conservation more broadly includes environmentalism. History. Early history. The conservation movement can be traced back to John Evelyn's work Silva, presented as a paper to the Royal Society in 1662. Published as a book 2 years later, it was one of the most highly influential texts on forestry ever published. Timber resources in England were becoming dangerously depleted at the time, and Evelyn advocated the importance of conserving the forests by managing the rate of depletion and ensuring that the cut-down trees get replenished. The field developed during the 18th century, especially in Prussia and France, where scientific forestry methods were developed. These methods were first applied rigorously in British India from the early 19th century. The government was interested in the use of forest produce and began managing the forests with measures to reduce the risk of wildfire in order to protect the household of nature, as it was then termed. This early ecological idea was in order to preserve the growth of delicate teak trees, which was an important resource for the Royal Navy. Concerns over teak depletion were raised as early as 1799 and 1805, when the Navy was undergoing a massive expansion during the Napoleonic Wars. This pressure led to the first formal Conservation Act, which prohibited the felling of small teak trees. The first forestry officer was appointed in 1806 to regulate and preserve the trees necessary for shipbuilding. This promising start received a setback in the 1820s and 30s, when laissez-faire economics and complaints from private landowners brought these early conservation attempts to an end. In 1837, American poet George Pope Morris published Woodman, Spare That Tree, a romantic poem urging a lumberjack to avoid an oak tree that has sentimental value. The poem was set to music later that year by Henry Russell. Lines from the song have been quoted by environmentalists. Origins of the modern conservation movement. Conservation was revived in the mid-19th century with the first practical application of scientific conservation principles to the forests of India. The conservation ethic that began to evolve included three core principles: that human activity damaged the environment, that there was a civic duty to maintain the environment for future generations, and that scientific, empirically based methods should be applied to ensure this duty was carried out. Sir James Ranald Martin was prominent in promoting this ideology, publishing many medico-topographical reports that demonstrated the scale of damage wrought through large-scale deforestation and desiccation, and lobbying extensively for the institutionalization of forest conservation activities in British India through the establishment of forest departments. Edward Percy Stebbing warned of desertification of India. The Madras Board of Revenue started local conservation efforts in 1842, headed by Alexander Gibson, a professional botanist who systematically adopted a forest conservation program based on scientific principles. This was the first case of state management of forests in the world. These local attempts gradually received more attention by the British government as the unregulated felling of trees continued unabated. In 1850, the British Association in Edinburgh formed a committee to study forest destruction at the behest of Dr. Hugh Cleghorn, a pioneer in the nascent conservation movement. He had become interested in forest conservation in Mysore in 1847 and gave several lectures at the association on the failure of agriculture in India. These lectures influenced the government under Governor-General Lord Dalhousie to introduce the first permanent and large-scale forest conservation program in the world in 1855, a model that soon spread to other colonies, as well the United States. In the same year, Cleghorn organized the Madras Forest Department, and in 1860 the department banned the use shifting cultivation. Cleghorn's 1861 manual, The Forests and Gardens of South India, became the definitive work on the subject and was widely used by forest assistants in the subcontinent. In 1861, the Forest Department extended its remit into the Punjab. Sir Dietrich Brandes, a German forester, joined the British service in 1856 as superintendent of the teak forests of Pegu Division in eastern Burma. During that time, Burma's teak forests were controlled by militant Karen tribals. He introduced the Tangi system, in which Karen villagers provided labor for clearing, planting and weeding teak plantations. After 7 years in Burma, Brandes was appointed Inspector General of Forests in India, a position he served in for 20 years. He formulated new forest legislation and helped establish research and training institutions. The Imperial Forest School at Dehradun was founded by him. Germans were prominent in the forestry administration of British India. As well as Brandes, Berthold Ribbentrop and Sir William P. D. Schlich brought new methods to Indian conservation, the latter becoming the Inspector General in 1883 after Brandes stepped down. Schlich helped to establish the journal Indian Forester in 1874 and became the founding director of the first forestry school in England at Cooper's Hill in 1885. He authored the 5-volume Manual of Forestry 1889-96 on silviculture, forest management, forest protection, and forest utilization, which became the standard and enduring textbook for forestry students. Conservation in the United States. Since 1970, environmental reemerged on the national agenda in 1970, with Republican Richard Nixon playing a major role, especially with his creation of the Environmental Protection Agency. The debates over the public lands and environmental politics played a supporting role in the decline of liberalism and the rise of modern environmentalism. Although Americans consistently rank environmental issues as important, polling data indicates that in the voting booth voters rank the environmental issues low relative to other political concerns. The growth of the Republican Party's political power in the Inland West apart from the Pacific Coast was facilitated by the rise of popular opposition to public lands reform. Successful Democrats in the Inland West and Alaska typically take more conservative positions on environmental issues than Democrats from the coastal states. Conservatives drew on new organizational networks of think tanks, industry groups, and citizen-oriented organizations, and they began to deploy new strategies that affirmed the rights of individuals to their property, protection of extraction rights, to hunt and recreate, and to pursue happiness unencumbered by the federal government at the expense of resource conservation. In 2019, convivial conservation was an idea proposed by Bram Buster and Robert Fletcher. Convivial conservation draws on social movements and concepts like environmental justice and structural change to create a post-capitalist approach to conservation. Conservation in Costa Rica. Worldwide Fund for Nature. You know, when we first set up WWF, our objective was to save endangered species from extinction. But we have failed completely. We haven't managed to save a single one. If only we had put all that money into condoms, we might have done some good. The Worldwide Fund for Nature (WWF) is an international non-governmental organization founded in 1961. It was formerly named the World Wildlife Fund, which remains its official name in Canada and the United States. WWF is the world's largest conservation organization, with over 5 million supporters worldwide, working in more than 100 countries, supporting around 1,300 conservation and environmental projects. They have invested over $1 billion in more than 12,000 conservation initiatives since 1995. WWF is a foundation with 55% of funding from individuals and bequests 19% from government sources such as the World Bank, DFID, UZ, and 8% from corporations in 2014. WWF aims to stop the degradation of the planet's natural environment and to build a future in which humans live in harmony with nature. The Living Planet report is published every 2 years by WWF since 1998. It is based on a Living Planet index and ecological footprint calculation. In addition, WWF has launched several notable worldwide campaigns including Earth Hour and Debt for Nature Swap, and its current work is organized around these 6 areas: food, climate, freshwater, wildlife, forests, and oceans. Conservation FAR approach. A conservation-exploitation dichotomy has plagued a place many may not expect: conservation institutions. Institutions such as the WWF have historically been the cause of the displacement and divide between native populations and the lands they inhabit. The overbearing reason behind this rather contradictory truth is because of the organization's historically colonial, patronistic, and neoliberal approaches to conservation. Klaus, in his article Drawing the Sea Near, Satami and Coral Reef Conservation in Okinawa, expands on these approaches and their effectiveness, not as much in conservation, but in creating the value of and commercializing endangered flora and fauna. One way in which this has taken place is through a separation between people, even locals, and the nature spaces they aimed to protect. This is what Klaus calls the conservation farm method, in which access to lands is completely relinquished upon the locals and tourists by an external foreign entity. This entity is largely unaware of the customs and values held by those within the territory surrounding nature and their role within it. Klaus relays the history of an island in Japan, Shuraho, in which the people's traditional ways of tending to nature were lost due to modernization and the rise of a fast-paced lifestyle. It is the view of a conservation near approach that would suggest a regeneration of these customs within the local area. This engages those near in proximity to the lands in the conservation efforts and holds them accountable for their direct effects on its preservation. Unlike the hands-on, full sensory experience permitted by conservation near methodologies, conservation FAR drills visuals and sight as being the main interaction medium between people and the environment. An emphasis on observation only stems from a deeper association with intellect and observation. The alternative to this is more of a bodily or primitive consciousness, which is associated with lower intelligence and people of color. A new integrated approach to conservation is being investigated in recent years by institutions such as WWF. Evidence-based conservation. Areas of concern. Deforestation and overpopulation are issues affecting all regions of the world. The consequent destruction of wildlife habitat has prompted the creation of conservation groups in other countries, some founded by local hunters who have witnessed declining wildlife populations firsthand. Also, it was highly important for the conservation movement to solve problems of living conditions in the cities and the overpopulation of such places. Boreal forest and the Arctic. The idea of incentive conservation is a modern one, but its practice has clearly defended some of the subarctic wildernesses and the wildlife in those regions for thousands of years, especially by indigenous peoples such as the Evenk, Yakut, Sami, Inuit, and Cree. The fur trade and hunting by these peoples have preserved these regions for thousands of years. Ironically, the pressure now upon them comes from non-renewable resources such as oil, sometimes to make synthetic clothing, which is advocated as a humane substitute for fur. See raccoon dog for case study of the conservation of an animal through fur trade. Similarly, in the case of the beaver, hunting and fur trade were thought to bring about the animal's demise, when in fact they were an integral part of its conservation. For many years, children's books stated, and still do, that the decline in the beaver population was due to the fur trade. In reality, however, the decline in beaver numbers was because of habitat destruction and deforestation, as well as its continued persecution as a pest. It causes flooding. In Cree lands, however, where the population valued the animal for meat and fur, it continued to thrive. The Inuit defend their relationship with the seal in response to outside critics. Latin America, Bolivia. The Isaceno Guarani of Santa Cruz Department, Bolivia, is a tribe of hunters who were influential in establishing the Capitania del Alto y Bajo Isoso Cabay. Cabay promotes economic growth and survival of the Isaceno people while discouraging the rapid destruction of habitat within Bolivia's Gran Chaco. They are responsible for the creation of the 34,000 square kilometer Caia del Gran Chaco National Park and Integrated Management Area KINP. The KINP protects the most biodiverse portion of the Gran Chaco, an ecoregion shared with Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil. In 1996, the Wildlife Conservation Society joined forces with Cabay to institute wildlife and hunting monitoring programs in 23 Isaceno communities. The partnership combines traditional beliefs and local knowledge with the political and administrative tools needed to effectively manage habitats. The programs rely solely on voluntary participation by local hunters who perform self-monitoring techniques and keep records of their hunts. The information obtained by the hunters participating in the program has provided Cabay with important data required to make educated decisions about the use of the land. Hunters have been willing participants in this program because of pride in their traditional activities, encouragement by their communities, and expectations of benefits to the area. Africa, Botswana. In order to discourage illegal South African hunting parties and ensure future local use and sustainability, indigenous hunters in Botswana began lobbying for and implementing conservation practices in the 1960s. The Fauna Preservation Society of Ngamiland FPS was formed in 1962 by the husband and wife team, Robert K. and June K. environmentalists working in conjunction with the Batwana tribes to preserve wildlife habitat. The FPS promotes habitat conservation and provides local education for preservation of wildlife. Conservation initiatives were met with strong opposition from the Botswana government because of the monies tied to big game hunting. In the 1963, Batawanga chiefs and tribal hunter-adventurers, in conjunction with the FPS, founded Mormi National Park and Wildlife Refuge, the first area to be set aside by tribal people rather than governmental forces. Mormi National Park is home to a variety of wildlife, including lions, giraffes, elephants, buffalo, zebra, cheetahs, and antelope, and covers an area of 3,000 square kilometers. Most of the groups involved with establishing this protected land were involved with hunting and were motivated by their personal observations of declining wildlife and habitat.